dictum in the case, it's simply extraneous words, and it doesn't have precedential value in and of itself. But what we have often found over the years, since the Constitution was written, is that sometimes dictum, even though it could be an offhand phrase, will later on become a holding in a case.
All right, Ricky, stand by. I want to keep talking to you, but I want to go to Paula Reed, who's standing outside of the courthouse. Paula, I don't know if you were in the courthouse, but what can you tell us from your vantage point?
I was not in the courthouse. I've been standing outside relying on the great reporting of our colleague Claire Himes, and she tells us that for the judge, everything was about due process. And the judge decided that Acosta should get his pass back because the White House denied him due process. They didn't give him any notice that his pass is going to be revoked or any chance to rebut the White House's reasoning for trying to take it away. Now, I do not think this is going to be the last word in this ongoing feud. It is likely the White House could try to appeal this, but round one goes to Acosta. He's getting his White House credentials back.
Wait, sorry, Paul, when you say round one, could there be another round?
Well, like I just said, the White House could easily appeal this. This was just a temporary restraining order. This is the first phase. This case still could be appealed. They could try to argue that he should not immediately get his pass back, and then this case will likely go forward on the merits to decide this larger issue of who is entitled to a White House pass, what kind of due process are they due. As you and Ricky were just talking about, there's a precedent from the 1970s. But a lot's happened since then, in particular 9/11, and there are some security concerns, and it is likely that the White House would like some further guidance from the courts on the extent to which they can restrict access. Because these White House passes, this gives you access to the briefing room, press conferences, but because our president is fond of doing impromptu press availabilities, you also get very close to him, which is great because you get the opportunity to ask questions, but I would imagine that the White House will not be pleased with this and could try to appeal.
All right, Paula, stand by. I apologize because I couldn't hear you at all because we're having some technical difficulties with our earpieces. But let's keep you and let's bring Ricky into the discussion because it's rare that we have two lawyers on set with us at the same time. So let's keep this discussion going, Ricky. So Paula mentions the fact that the White House may appeal this. Is it a good look for the White House to look, stepping away a little bit from the legalities here? The president of the United States does not have to call on Jim Acosta if he doesn't think Jim Acosta is a good reporter, if he thinks Acosta is rude, if he doesn't like the way Acosta, he doesn't have to call on him.
Exactly correct.
So I don't get why they would continue to sort of push this or even appeal this when a lot of people are looking at this and saying, look, this is about a White House trying to restrict freedom of the press. Just don't call on the guy. There's 50 other reporters in the room. What's the big deal? Well,
I think you're right. What's the big deal? Because there are all these other reporters in the room, and he does not have to call on Jim Acosta at any time if he doesn't want to. There are lots of reporters raising their hands all the time. There are lots of reporters shouting out questions all the time. And so you will find that he will probably not call on Jim Acosta, and that should be that. In terms of an issue of appeal, let's remember two different things. Number one, this is a temporary restraining order. It is very rare that any appellate court will look to take a case at the level of a temporary restraining order. Has it happened? Yes, it has. Does it happen often? Absolutely not. Rather, they would wait until the next situation, which is a preliminary injunction being issued, and then a permanent injunction, and then they could decide to appeal. In terms of optics, I don't think that the president or those who advise him really care about the optics. I think that they would go forward with an appeal should it be necessary.
Hang on one second, Ricky. These look to be the attorneys for Jim Acosta, because I see Jim right there. Let's listen.
Get his hard pass and report the news about the White House. I'll turn it over to Jim.
Okay. Everybody, thanks for coming. I just want to say something very briefly, and that is I want to thank all of my colleagues in the press who supported us this week. And I want to thank the judge for the decision he made today. And let's go back to work. Thank you.
When do you expect to get
whether or not what do you think the likelihood
should there be press?
All right. Just brief comments there from Jim Acosta, thanking the members of the press who supported him as well as the judge. You know, it's interesting, Ricky. A lot of people were surprised when Fox News, along with CBS News and other major news organizations, sided with CNN during this lawsuit. But The danger here, the danger that the president was setting, the precedent that the president was setting, and why Fox News, its news division, decided to do this, because it could one day be a Democratic president who doesn't like a Fox News reporter who tries to do the same thing. It has nothing to do with red or blue, Democrat or Republican, support of the president or not. Essentially, what Fox and other news organizations were saying is that you can't do this.
Right. And of course, Fox News should join as a friend of the court brief because it doesn't matter who is in the White House. It's about the right of access and the right of freedom of the press. And it goes back to what I said before. This is the people's house. This does not belong to a red state or a blue state or a person who supports red or blue. It belongs to the United States of America. It is so critical, I cannot stress it enough, of how important the Fourth Estate, the press, really is. And the press has been demonized during the last 2 years. We know that. Well, it's okay, because the president, Donald Trump himself, also has freedom of speech under the First Amendment. And he can say what he likes, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
But the reality is that we are, that is the collective press. I'm a legal analyst, I'm not a journalist, but I work for CBS News. The collective press must be permitted to do its job. If people don't like what is said on CNN, turn by all means to Fox News. If you don't like what's said on Fox News, turn by all means to MSNBC. And of course, everyone should turn to CBS.
That's right. Here's the other sort of the way I kind of look at this, and as it played out over the last couple of days. In the wake of that press conference, as we've been saying, the president did not have to call on Jim. Jim is antagonistic towards the president. That's his job as he sees it, and the president doesn't have to call on him. There was some question as to the reasons why his press pass was taken away. Sarah Huckabee Sanders released a statement saying Jim Acosta had done something. Then they changed the story again. And of course, when they get before a judge, you can't lie to a judge. You can say a lot of things to rally up your base about what the press is doing, the enemy of the people, as the president likes to call them. But when you're sitting in front of a judge, you can't make up stuff about.
Well, the argument about Mr. Acosta's behavior, whether or not he allegedly wound up touching or hitting the young intern with the microphone, was taken out of this case by the lawyers. They took it out. They were not going to deal with that argument in front of this judge. And what to me was fairly astounding, I have to say, as I read the news reports, was the argument by the administration, that is on behalf of President Trump, by the lawyer at the hearing itself, of basically saying that the president can do anything he wants in terms of these press conferences and, in fact, in terms of access to the White House. What Paula brought up about the issues of security is very valid. You would not allow someone into the White House premises who is a security threat. But you would have to show that they're a security threat. And you are not a security threat as being a member of the press who asks uncomfortable or antagonistic questions. One of the phrases that the lawyer for CNN talked about was that Mr. Trump is, quote unquote, the most aggressive, dare I say, the rudest person in the room. And the lawyer continued that he's the one who encourages a rough and tumble discussion.
Right.
Whether or not he is the instigator or he is on the receiving end, the reality is this. If you only wanted to call, if the president only wanted to call on friendly reporters, he has the ability to do it.
And you mentioned Paula, and Paula is still with us. Paula, sorry, I thought we had lost your shot, but I'm glad you're still with us to talk about this. So we'll keep the discussion between the three of us. We'll keep that going. You could hear Ricky talking about the access that you and other reporters have to the White House. Explain to our viewers sort of the level of scrutiny that goes into a reporter getting a White House press credential that allows them to be on the White House, to be in the West Wing with the President of the United States.
That's right. It's a significant credential to have because at any moment you can get through the White House gates and report from the grounds. And like I said, it's not just press briefings, press conferences, but this president, for as much as he complains about the press, we had our own Mark Knoller run the numbers. And the fact is that President Trump has held more press availabilities than his two predecessors combined. by the same time in his administration. He likes to talk to us before he gets on his helicopter to take off or to wherever. He's also even one time came down where we all shoot our live shots to talk to us. I mean, the access once you get in those gates in this administration, it's quite remarkable. Now, in order to get one of these credentials, your organization that you work for typically needs to apply on your behalf and sort of prove that you will use it and that they will testify for you. But we know right now they are going through all of the credentials that have been issued to people, and they are culling that list. They are taking away credentials from people who have not been going in as consistently or as frequently. It's clear there's an effort here that they want to limit the number of people who actually have those passes. But, you know, I do want to remind people that for as much as the president complains about the press, he does answer more questions from us. The problem is when we have those interactions, there is often a lack of civility and also a lack of honesty and truthfulness, too. So it's fascinating times.
Stand by, Paula. Ricky, you wanted to add to this.
I just wanted to add to that. What's interesting about this opinion is that the judge really is not relying so much on First Amendment grounds. He's relying on Fifth Amendment grounds. He's relying on the issue of due process, whereas I think most of the scholars who looked at this case expected it to happen on First Amendment grounds, but that's not what happened.
And Paula, we did get a statement from CNN, and it says this: "We are gratified with this result, and we look forward to a full resolution in the coming days. Our sincere thanks to all who have supported not just CNN, but a free, strong, and independent American press." You know, Paula, and so our viewers should understand, just because Jim's pass was revoked, it did not mean that CNN did not have representation in the White House press corps. There are other CNN correspondents who are there on a daily basis, and CNN producers.
Absolutely. There are dozens of other CNN employees. I believe the White House put out the number at around 50 other people who have presses who have been reporting daily. And I think Ricky makes a good point. I mean, this was decided on due process, not First Amendment. CNN sued, arguing that the White House had violated Jim Acosta's First Amendment right to free speech and his Fifth Amendment right to due process. I think one of the reasons you're seeing this decided on due process is because there's a very solid argument there. You just took away his pass. You didn't tell him why. You didn't tell him it was coming. You just showed up for work one day and you made him yank it out of the plastic and hand it back. This judge is saying perhaps he should have been notified, had a chance to respond. The issue with First Amendment grounds here is I do think it would be difficult to make a case, a solid case, that you have a First Amendment right to report inside the gates of the White House. Again, oftentimes in very close proximity to the president. I think in post 9/11 era, I think it would be very difficult to argue that your First Amendment right is that absolute. No one was preventing Acosta from reporting in Paris on the president's trip or outside the gates of the White House. I do think the First Amendment ground on this case is certainly not as secure or as solid as due process. And remember, this case has a long way to go. This is just the first step. Now they will ultimately hear this on the merits, and if Acosta continues to prevail, it will likely be on due process, not First Amendment.
So let's just read a statement that we received from the ACLU. This is from Ben Weisner, the director of the American Civil Liberties Union. This is the statement. Today's decision reaffirms that no one, not even the president, is above the law. The White House surely hoped that expelling a reporter would deter forceful questioning, but the court's ruling will have the opposite effect. The freedom of the press is a bedrock principle, and our democracy is strengthened when journalists challenge our leaders rather than defer to them. But, Ricky, what about that? I think for a lot of folks who are not in the Washington, New York media bubble, they might think to themselves, look, the White House is the people's house, but it is also the residence of the President of the United States, his wife, his son, and if the president wants to bar an individual, if they're a reporter, if they're, a chef, he can do that.
Well, ultimately, of course, he can do that. But what happened here, it's so interesting to actually look at the ruling itself. This is not a broad ruling. This is a very narrow ruling, now that it's done on Fifth Amendment due process grounds. It's the fact that his pass was taken away for no reason. There was no process. So if there's no process, you do not get the process that is due you. That's a very different case than the broad-based First Amendment that the ACLU's comment makes it look like it is, or that I might have thought it was before we looked at the opinion.
Yeah. Paula, some final thoughts from you. I mean, I think it's, sort of interesting to me that if you look back through the course of televised news conferences with reporters going back to, I believe it was really John F. Kennedy who sort of made it a regular thing. Reporters have always been a thorn in the side of the President of the United States and others. And that's just the known. Every president comes into office knowing that they're going to have to deal with an antagonistic press. That is the role of the press. You said something really interesting, Paula. You talked about how this president has been more accessible than any other president, at least over the last couple of presidencies, to the press, because we all know, Ricky and I are New Yorkers. We know that Donald Trump likes reporters, right? There's no doubt in anybody's mind that the president likes to chew the fat with reporters. I think when he became president, he all of a sudden became aware of what it would be like to deal with a press that is antagonistic, and that is perhaps what has thrown him off a little bit of the game. But, you know, are you hearing from the White House that they may just decide this is just not worth, the optics are not worth it to continue down this path?
When you say continue down this path, continue to revoke White House press credentials or continue to let us at the White House?
Continue to revoke White House press credentials for reporters that they don't like.
I don't know that this is actually going to deter the White House.
Wow.
I think in the future, based on this narrow ruling, is in the future, they'll just let you know what they're doing, allow you to rebut their decision, and then make their decision. Ultimately, we need to see how this case is decided in the end on the merits when we get a final decision on this issue. But as Ricky said, this is a narrow ruling. They're saying what you did wrong is you didn't give him a chance to plead his case. And to hear out why it was being rejected and maybe put up a little defense. That was the judge's argument. So all the White House really has to do now under this opinion is give whoever they want to revoke a pass from due process. As you noted, the president does enjoy press attention, but he's used to a different kind of press. He's used to sort of more the gossip, the Hollywood kind of access. Hollywood, that was probably a terrible example, but he's probably used to a more Hollywood celebrity kind of press, not the Washington press corps, which is very aggressive, very fact-based. And as I said, even though we get a lot of access to him, we certainly don't always get hospitality. And honestly, the biggest problem is that we don't always get accuracy or statements that are truthful. And in these casual press interactions we have with him, when we ask him questions he doesn't like, it's very easy for him to just quickly walk away.
Right.
So while we do appreciate the opportunity to ask him questions, the biggest problem is that you don't always have a chance to follow up, and that's how we got ourselves in this situation. Acosta was trying to ask more than one question. I think he got to his third question, and the president tried to cut him off.
Yeah, and I'll let you go, Paula, but you make a really excellent point there about the accessibility of the president of the United States to the press. It is true he is more accessible than other presidents past, but the information that usually comes from the president is one that leaves reporters scrambling because many and oftentimes they're stated inaccurately or they're simply not true, and reporters then generally have to follow with people, whether it's Sarah Huckabee Sanders or others within the administration. And when it comes to transparency from that end, from the press shop of the White House, it has been not as transparent as others in the past. So yes, it's great to get access to the president, but to follow up on those questions, the president, making statements, broad statements about things, that's not always as easy. Paula, thank you so much for spending some time with us, breaking this down. As always, we appreciate it. We'll talk to you in a little while. Ricky, you're still with us. Final thoughts on this? I was actually, you heard me say wow when Paula said, because I'm not a lawyer and I'm listening to this and you're looking at all the statements that are coming out from CNN, from the ACLU, First Amendment. So everybody's going to walk away from this going, yes, the judge stood for the First Amendment rights of Jim Acosta and CNN. But as Paula mentions, it's really not about that.
No, it's not about that at all. And in fact, when the judge looks at the First Amendment, he basically says the public doesn't have a right to enter the White House grounds. I have no quarrel with that at all, the judge says. But he applies the precedent of what we call the Fifth Amendment, the due process grounds. So because it is so narrow, frankly, I do agree with Paula. I think that all the president and his staff have to do is do the appropriate notice as to the fact that they would take away a press pass, allow the person to respond, give that person or that network or that media outlet due process, and then can still make a decision based on the equities. But what I really want you to watch for this afternoon, and I will too, and I think that all of our viewers should, is that I will bet when you get a statement or a tweet from the White House or from Sarah Huckabee Sanders, that they will talk about the fact that see, the president does have the right to exclude whom he chooses to exclude from White House grounds. And so the president was in the right all along. Well, perhaps we should have done it a little differently. So now we have some instruction. You watch.
We will be watching indeed. If there's one thing we know about this president, in addition to loving the media when it's favorable to him, is he likes to tumble. He likes to mix it up.
Oh, it's a great spin zone.
He likes to mix it up. Ricky and Paula, thank you both. Appreciate it. All right, we're going to take a quick break. Lots more news ahead on CBSN. Coming close to the top of the hour, we got updates on the fires raging in California, the winter storm that was yesterday, even though we're in the middle of autumn. Look at that beautiful picture, live shot right there of the White House, those beautiful autumn leaves. Just a couple of hours ago, they were covered in snow last night. Still some snow here in New York City. We'll be talking about that. Stick around. You're watching CBSN.
Sponsored by CA Technologies.
Our collective understanding of artificial intelligence is heavily influenced by movies and pop culture, but that's not the reality. Jason Heiner is a global editor-in-chief of Tech Republic. He joins me now from San Francisco. So, Jason, what the heck is really AI, and what's new in the field of AI?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of our conceptions of AI are based on these ideas from like the Terminator and iRobot, where it's mostly this idea that these robots and artificial intelligence might destroy humanity one day, that they might get even smarter than human beings. But the reality is that our problem with AI today isn't so much that it's too smart, it's that it's not smart enough. And there's a lot of things that we're trying to do with AI and to make life better for people, to make work